Welcome to the Contracting Officer Podcast. It's not just for contracting officers. If you work anywhere in the government acquisition world, this podcast is for you. Our topic today is prioritization and risk. Speaking of priorities, make it a priority to join us in the Contracting Officer Podcast group on LinkedIn. And another priority, let's get this episode started.
I got some great advice a few years ago. Don't be busy, be productive. And I've used that concept a lot and to prioritize and really keep from being busy. Busy becomes a 4-letter word. We're all busy. I mean, very, very few successful people are looking for ways to fill their calendar. I mean, we're all busy. It's how it feels. Here's another quote that really poked me in the eye. So from Tim Ferriss. It says, being busy is a form of laziness. It's really just a lack of prioritization. And I thought, ouch, it's painfully true.
That's an interesting way to look at it. Today, we're going to talk about a strategy that can be used to help prioritize things.
One of the tactics I use when prioritizing projects is to ask, what's going to happen in 6 months if I don't do this? The value of this question comes into clear view in post-award contract execution. In other words, when both government team and the industry team look at all the tasks that are piled up in a contract, asking what will happen in 6 months if we don't do them helps clarify, which plates do we start spinning first, and which ones is it okay if they hit the ground once in a while.
Before we start spinning any plates, let's stop and say thanks.
Thanks this week goes to Kurt Hatfield and April Barkasi from Cedarville Engineering Group. Cedarville is an 8A women-owned small business in the Philadelphia, Pennsylvania area, and they deliver civil engineering, environmental services, surveying, and construction management services. I met Kurt after I spoke at a conference recently, and I'd like to thank both of them for investing their time in listening to the podcast and for taking extra time to give us our feedback. Feedback from new listeners is particularly valuable because it helps us understand the first impression we're presenting to people who find the Contracting Officer podcast each week.
Thanks, Kurt and April. Today, we're talking about prioritization, and we're using a concept called the 6-month rule. Contract management is not a sexy task. As a contract manager, you often feel like the electric company, where as long as the power is on, everyone's happy and no one thinks about it. But as soon as the power goes out, suddenly it's front and center and the most important thing ever.
I was thinking about the 6-month rule because at Skyway, some of our members come to us with post-award problems like wanting to get reimbursed for a government-caused delay or a government-caused cost, or wanting to negotiate or renegotiate a CPARS rating that didn't go favorably, or they're looking for how to tactfully defend against scope creep of when things getting added to the contract, they want to defend against that. Or they're just wanting to get paid on time. These are all post-award activities.
The issues that show up because of these kind of problems are manageable, but only if you do it before those issues materialize. Afterwards, you're in cleanup mode. It's easy to talk about preparing. It's a little more difficult to actually prepare because you have to prioritize that preparation.
You have to work on things that you aren't going to feel for up to 6 months. That's a different mindset. Preparing is easy. We just have to do it.
It sounds really easy in theory. Government contracts don't operate on theory, though. They operate on contract words, and they're filled with all kinds of steps, tasks, submittals, reports, requirements. That's what makes them so thick.
For example, Section I, that's all the clauses. That alone can be enormous, especially when you consider that many of the dozens of clauses, they're in there by reference, which means that they take up one line in the contract, but the actual clause they're referencing may be pages long. We actually talked about that in episode 82, where we discussed how clauses are selected and why some are actually incorporated by reference. And it's probably just to save space.
It's really complicated for any company to manage all these tasks, to understand what's actually required of all those clauses. It can be even harder for a small business that may not have all the resources or all the experience about which are the most important things and which are not.
There are so many requirements in a government contract that it's not practical to do them all. I mean, we have to prioritize them.
So it's not practical, but
Yeah.
it is required. I
It
mean,
is
you sign a
required,
contract
yes.
with all these things. This is more about risk tolerance and risk management and doing the most important things first.
And the best way to do that is to ask yourself, what will happen in 6 months if we don't do this? The trick, of course, is to be able to project what's going to happen. I mean, our podcast episodes are sprinkled with clues about what's going to happen when you do this or that.
For this episode, we're going to focus on a few key areas that have the highest risk if you don't do them. The highest risk of something going wrong 6 months from now if you haven't paid attention. The first thing I think everybody needs to understand is what contract type are we dealing with here? Because the contract type defines how the contract risk is allocated between government and industry. Who bears the cost of a contract overrun? Or is the scope really defined well enough for this to be a fixed price arrangement? If you don't understand what type of contract it is, then you don't understand how to manage everything else that we're going to talk about here in a minute, because it can be different.
And it can be particularly challenging when the same contract may have different contract types for the different types of work within it.
And that would be assigned by CLIN. And that's the next biggest thing that you should understand.
We talked about how CLINs are used to distribute the work into manageable chunks in a contract. And if the chunks are not clearly understood, the problems are sitting on the horizon then. Because if you don't understand what the CLIN is or what's in that individual CLIN, or back to your contract type, if you don't understand how the contract type applies to that CLIN, you're going to end up with miscommunication and having to have lots of sideways activity cleaning it up later. I had a contract where we had contractor acquired property, which was a firm fixed price CLIN on an otherwise cost plus award fee contract. What would happen from the accounting side is that the contractor would get authorization to go buy things, equipment, property for this contract. It was all firm fixed price. Well, fast forward a year after they bought it and they say, oh, actually this cost came in higher. And then I had this really awkward conversation of, well, that's a firm fixed price CLIN. Like, well, the contract's cost plus award fee. Every other CLIN is cost plus award fee, but that one's firm fixed price. And that's an awkward conversation. So what's going to happen in 6 months in that case, if they didn't understand the impact of how that CLIN is structured and the contract type, is they got a bill from their supplier that exceeded what we paid them. That's called losing money. Not a good day.
I had a program manager who had always managed a time and materials contract, which means he got paid for each hour that he delivered working towards a goal. At some point, the government decided, we're going to change this to fixed price. We just want the goal. We don't care how many hours you spend doing it. We know what a fair price is for this final deliverable. We're willing to pay you that. We don't care about tracking all the hours that go into it anymore. The program manager's mindset was still on, I have to deliver all of these hours to get all the money. He wasn't looking to be more efficient. And he wasn't worried about if things go wrong, I still have to complete this for the same amount of money. He was used to getting dollars per hour. Good to understand that up front. If you don't, at the beginning of the contract, take a moment to talk about what contract type each CLIN is. You may run into a situation where you're managing it wrong the whole time. 6 months later, when that comes into focus, it may be too late to recover.
And we do have an episode called What is a CLIN that talks through how those chunks are broken up and how the structure of the contract is built around them.
After you understand the contract type and the CLINs clearly, be sure you understand the scope of the work, the schedule, and the dollars allocated to it.
Those are Section C, Section F, and Section G, respectively, in the contract. If both sides clearly don't understand what's in those sections, things are likely, nay, almost guaranteed to get messy in 6 months is a good rule of thumb. During the honeymoon zone, be sure to clearly understand the delivery of the requirement in context of Section C and Section F and Section G. I had one where their understanding of delivery did not match when the payment was going to show up. The delivery was Section F, the payment was in Section G, and we passed each other in the night, and the accounting team on the contractor side was pretty mad when they didn't get paid when they thought they were going to. The smallest any misunderstanding is going to be is at the start of the contract. It's now. So deal with it now.
Right. The honeymoon zone is a great time to ask that question. What happens in 6 months? All right, we've talked contract type, we've talked CLIN structure and the contract type of each CLIN. We've talked section C, F, and G, the work, the schedule, the funding. Next, think about section H.
Section H is the special clauses that are specific to that contract. These clauses and instructions were likely developed just for the contract that you have. So that means that they're pretty important relative to that contract. So make sure you clearly understand those.
If someone took the time to build special clauses from scratch for this contract, they are going to expect that those clauses are followed explicitly.
And if there's a misunderstanding of how they work, yeah, raising my hand, I've done that from both sides. It can be very frustrating.
Then there's section I, and you mentioned this when we got started here. Section I is clause after clause after clause. Some contracts have more clauses in section I than others. And it's really hard to tell which clauses in section I have a big impact on the contract and contract performance, which ones only apply if specific things happen, if specific circumstances arise, and which clauses are just there because the FAR said so, or because the government folks didn't use the clause selection tool very well, and it just added a whole bunch of clauses that really don't apply at all. It's hard to tell, though. I mean, when you're looking at the contract, it's really hard to tell.
Some of those clauses are critical, and some of them, to your point, they may be decorative. They're just extra. They're not enforced or even enforceable on the particular contract they show up on. But all of them are non-negotiable because they're coming out of the FAR.
They're in your contract. They apply. Now you've done it. You mentioned the FAR. We're overdue in getting to FAR time and linking what we're talking about to FAR requirements. FAR 42.201 is contract administration responsibilities. 42.201 tells you that the contract administration office has to administer the contract. And 42.201A1 says perform the functions listed in 42.302A to the extent they apply to the contract. 42.302A, boy, I'm laying out a lot of FAR sites here.
Going off here.
42.302A has 71 subparagraphs.
That's funny because we covered this part in an earlier podcast. And back then, which I think was like 3 years ago, there were only 69 subparagraphs. So it's growing.
We got two more.
That's right.
When you look at this long list, you realize that not everyone will be completed for every single contract. Some because they don't apply or don't need to be completed, and some because they're so much lower priority and everyone seems to be overworked in the government contracting community.
If you look over this list of 71 items, it helps to prioritize the next 6 months because you start to see some of the things that are likely to happen on both sides.
Subparagraph 8 is issue notices of intent to disallow or not recognize costs. If a contracting officer delays issuing that notice, the contractor may not know that they're planning to submit costs for charges that aren't allowable.
Which, surprise, you're not getting reimbursed for this.
Yeah, you want to know that as soon as possible.
There you go.
On the other side, subparagraph 17 is monitor the contractor's financial condition and advise the contracting officer when it jeopardizes contract performance. That's something that the contract administration office is supposed to do. How much monitoring of the financial condition of contractors with ongoing contracts did you do as a contract administrator, Kevin?
Not much.
No.
I mean, that
you don't do that. You don't do that just for the heck of it in advance.
Yeah. That could be a heavy lift to say, okay, let's make sure their financials are in order.
You're not doing that on every contract all the time. It's something that would certainly help if you had time to do that, but boy, we don't have time or money or people to do that every day for every contract.
But the other side of that, why it's in here, is if you don't do that, what'll happen in 6 months is it jeopardizes contract performance. That's why it's in there. This is one of those that it's in the FAR as a gotcha, but realistically, that's a difficult one to keep up with.
Yeah, it's probably only done when there's other indicators that there's a problem, and then they might dig into the financial condition and make some decisions about what to do if it looks like it could jeopardize performance. Subparagraph 27 is perform property administration.
We have an episode about government furnished property, which is what this is talking about. If you don't manage the property well in 6 months, when somebody says, hey, where's that piece of equipment? That's a problem.
Yeah, from the industry side, even just the reporting. If you're not tracking the incoming and outgoing equipment, if you're not tracking on a daily basis when items are moved from one location to another, when you get to the end of the reporting period and you have to submit reports to the government on what property you have and where it's all at, it's a huge task to recreate and figure out what happened. That's something that you have to do on a daily basis if you have government property. Subparagraph 62 is negotiate and or execute supplemental agreements as required. That's something that has to have some kind of priority. If you sit on modifications forever, if they never get accomplished, then you run into issues with funding. You run into issues with the contractor needing to move forward and accomplish scope that's in this supplemental agreement. But if the mod isn't done, then it may not fit into the program schedule. So you can see, if you ask yourself, what's going to happen in 6 months if I don't get this mod done today? Well, in 6 months, you're not going to have the complete delivery that you expected because the contractor wasn't authorized to do it in time.
Or you might not have the funding, or it can sort of cascade of events where item A wasn't shipped and item B can't be shipped until item A is delivered, and cavalcade of frustration can come out of that.
Subparagraph 67, here's where you'll notice that these are not in any kind of priority order in the FAR.
That's a really good point.
Subparagraph 67 is support the program, product, and project offices regarding program reviews, program status, program performance, and actual or anticipated program problems. Did you go to every program management review for every contract that you managed, Kevin?
No, that is a wide net, particularly when it says program reviews, program status, and program performance on actual or anticipated program problems. The fact that it says anticipated leads to what's going to happen in 6 months. But going to every program review, that's a heavy lift for anybody, let alone somebody that's just managing a part of the overall program.
Yeah, I remember having to prioritize what I could attend and when. It would have been great. I would have been a better contracting officer for every contract if I could have lived alongside the program team and gone to every program review and status update. It's just not feasible. So you got to pick and choose which are the most important, which ones have potential problems. That's where you should apply your time. Unfortunately, as a contracting officer, most of the time you get involved is when there's an actual program problem, not when it's just anticipated. All right, for fun, let's talk about the two that are new since we last talked about this list. 42302A, subparagraph 70, is deobligate excess funds after final price determination. They must have put that in there because funds were expiring. They weren't being deobligated in a timely manner, so they put it in the FAR to have somewhere to point to say, the FAR says you have to do this after final price determination. It doesn't say immediately after, so...
Not going to add that now that you mentioned it.
Yeah, right. Subparagraph 71 says, ensure that the contractor has implemented the requirements of 52.203-13, Contractor Code of Business Ethics and Conduct. This one makes me laugh. There's a clause that says contractor must have a code of business ethics and conduct. And they had to add a subparagraph that says, ensure that they have a code of business ethics and conduct. The clause itself says you have to have one. You shouldn't need another paragraph to tell you, make sure they have one. Anyway, I'm way off topic. Why is this important? Why is prioritization important? Without prioritization, you may not accomplish the most important things first. Do you know what's important to you?
And by you, your customer, do you know what's important to your agency, to your side of the contract? Is it getting results? Is it getting the funds obligated? Is it serving the customer? On the industry side, is it getting paid?
Right.
Is it getting effective past performance documented? It depends on your point of view. Do you know what's important to your counterpart? Do you know what's important on the other side of the table? They may not even know what's important to them until they don't get it. Like the power. You don't know that it's important until, oh, look, I guess I really needed the power to do this piece.
This is the relationship piece of the job that we always talk about. Understanding what's important to your counterpart helps you prioritize.
Or there may be a change that was outside of their control that the sooner you know about it, the better. I had a contract where it was part of the contract was being performed in a foreign country. And that foreign country changed how they were taxing their people, right? It's the simplest way to think of it. Well, what that caused, that tax is a cost to our contractor for having these employees do the work. That tax increase was going to kick in on January 1st. If they had waited until, well, either after January 1st or until like December 10th to say, hey, by the way, we have this new cost coming up, it would have been very difficult to get it done. Instead, they say, we just found this out, and this isn't the invention of the 6-month rule, but it was actually 6 months ahead of time. They told me in June. They said, this foreign country has changed their rules. This is going to impact us starting in January. And so it took us about 3 months to renegotiate the whole thing. It ended up being added to the contract in October. So it flowed nicely in January, and it was not a crisis. That's what it looks like to think about what's going to happen in 6 months.
We'd be remiss if we didn't stop at this point and talk about the time zones. When does this occur in the acquisition process? Today, we're talking about execution issues. So in the execution time zones, the honeymoon zone, the prime time to think, what happens in 6 months if I don't do this today? But we're really talking about the performance zone, and you've even heard some things that show up in the recompete zone.
If you're not familiar with the execution time zones, they're in episode 84.
This philosophy, this think ahead 6 months thing, it applies everywhere in the government acquisition process and probably in your life as well. But we're not really talking about the acquisition time zones today. We're trying to keep the examples on the contract execution side. Specifically on the government side, why does the government care? Back to the power company or your internet provider, right? Until something breaks, you don't think about it. What will happen in 6 months if the government doesn't modify the contract to extend the period of performance or to add a new period of performance to the end?
Funds could expire. The contract could have a break in service, which means that we're not meeting the mission. And oh, by the way, the contractor could lose employees because they have to lay them off, which means now you have to go find them again. Those are all bad things.
What would happen in 6 months if the government doesn't take the time to get industry feedback to help them target the acquisition strategy for a recompete?
We risk getting dozens of proposals instead of a handful. We get untargeted proposals, or we get underqualified offers who just found this opportunity, aren't really familiar with it because they can't see the context that comes in through that communication. And then we end up arguing with, and I'm raising my hand, we end up arguing with those people at the debriefing because they didn't clearly understand the requirement because we didn't communicate as much ahead of time. Lesson learned.
Contrast that with what will happen in 6 months if the government doesn't update the subcontracting plan goals.
Not nearly as much. Is this supposed to happen? Yes. There's somebody checking the paperwork, but the importance of those three things, the relative importance of those three options, the last one is the one you deprioritize because the impact just isn't that big.
Right. If you have to make a decision about what gets done today and what doesn't, pick the contract modification over the more, I'll say, bureaucratic type things.
That's a nice way of saying it. There are lots of those.
Walking a tightrope here. Why does industry care? It still goes back to the power company analogy. All is good when there's power, but as soon as the power goes out, oh boy. What will happen in 6 months if the contractor doesn't submit the request for equitable adjustment in a timely manner and get it to negotiations, finish it, finalize it with the government?
What could happen is the government may not have the funds available in the next fiscal year. If it takes more than 6 months and we cross a fiscal year, and the contractor ends up losing money because in those 6 months, you're paying someone to do work that may or may not get reimbursed. And then the worst case of this is you end up having to lay those people off during that lengthy negotiation because you're not sure how you're going to be able to pay them.
What will happen in 6 months if the contractor agrees to an increase in scope without a modification to incorporate that increase into the contract?
Among many things, we risk the contract being recompeted without the contractor getting credit for doing extra work.
Or the contractor ends up in an overrun situation and doesn't make any profit on that extra work that they did. Or if the contract is never really modified, the contractor could run out of funding before completing the core work. They did some new work they weren't expecting to do, and that took people and energy and time away from the core work they were supposed to complete. They get to the end and they say, we didn't quite get the job done yet. We need more money. And the government says, wait, we thought that you were going to do that new work within the current money that you have. We don't have any more money. Then what happens?
That conversation happens because it's 6 months later. If it happens when the scope creep was in the conversation, it's easy to say, in 6 months, we're going to end up with a bill that we can't pay. Versus, hey, I got this bill. Oh, I can't pay it. Well, what happened? Well, 6 months ago, we should have had this conversation. See how the difference is? That's why it's important to ask this question.
We're talking about some pretty dire results there. Conversely, what will happen in 6 months if the contractor doesn't update their company policy about texting while driving?
Which there's actually a contract clause, and it's in by reference about that. That one is at the bottom of the priority list.
It's easy to do. It's easy to update a policy or create a policy that says don't text while you drive. But if you're looking at priorities, that time could be spent doing something much more important. Speaking of important, let's wrap this one up.
That's a good segue.
We got to end it sometime.
That's right. Despite the word requirements being binary, it's theoretical that you can get everything done. But the reality is that not all contract requirements are equal. On the government side, focus on sharing your customers' priorities. There are the priorities of this contract, your agency's priorities, and for that matter, your priorities. What are the things as you work with your counterpart that you have to get done? It's possible that they don't know. And on the industry side, if you don't know what your customers' priorities are, ask. Because again, if you don't know what their priorities are, you're going to frustrate each other.
If time gets tight and you have to decide what to do first, it's good to know what your customer expects to be done first and what they might not care about so much.
Yeah, so some reports you can turn them in after the end of the fiscal year and the machine will keep going just fine.
This whole episode, we're talking somewhat philosophically about prioritization. I don't want anyone to forget that all contract requirements are requirements. It's like you said, binary. It either is or it isn't. And if it's in the contract, it is. You are in breach of that contract if you don't comply with everything it says. What we're talking about here is prioritization through risk management. What's your risk tolerance? What's the worst that can happen if this doesn't get done? And how do you manage that risk? And it's different for every company, every contract, every situation. And we've exceeded our risk tolerance for long episodes here. So that's it for today. I'll talk to you later, Kevin.
I'll see you, Paul.
Okay, that's it for this episode. Thanks for joining us. If you need help prioritizing contract execution tasks, Skyway Acquisition's team of former contracting officers helps companies just like yours. Visit AskSkyway.com or call Skyway Acquisition at 877-884-5280. We'll see you next week.